In the annals of American history, some stories are deliberately buried, erased from textbooks and collective memory. One such story is that of Margaret Garner, an enslaved woman whose life and desperate choices exposed the brutal reality of slavery in the United States. Garner's story is not just a tale of suffering. It is a chilling account of a mother pushed to the unimaginable limits by a society built on oppression. In 1856, after escaping from a Kentucky plantation to Ohio, Margaret made a decision so shocking that it stunned the nation. In an attempt to save her children from a life of enslavement, she killed one of them. Her tragic act sparked national debate, raising questions about morality, freedom, and the legal definitions of personhood under the fugitive slave law. Yet despite its significance, Margaret Garner's story has often been minimized, forgotten, or sanitized in mainstream histories. Exploring her life reveals not only the horrors of slavery but also the extraordinary courage, despair, and resistance of those whom history tried to erase. Margaret Garner was born into a world defined by cruelty, oppression, and the rigid hierarchies of slavery in the United States. Her birth in 1833 in Kentucky placed her squarely in the heart of the slaveholding South, a region where the institution of slavery was not only an economic system but a deeply ingrained social order that dictated every aspect of a person's life, particularly for Black people born into bondage. From the very moment of her birth, Margaret's life was shaped by forces beyond her control, forces that would determine her family, her labor, her freedom, and ultimately the moral and physical boundaries she would confront throughout her short life. Being born into slavery meant that Margaret, like countless others, was considered property first and human second. Her parents, whose identities are partially lost to history but whose presence looms in the backdrop of her story, would have known that the life of their daughter was predetermined in ways that no child should ever face. She was immediately bound by a system that denied her basic autonomy, a system that commodified her existence, and a society that instilled fear and submission from infancy. Margaret's early years would have been marked by the labor expected of enslaved children. Starting at a very young age, children in slavery were often put to work as soon as they could stand and walk, performing tasks that were physically demanding and emotionally taxing. They were expected to contribute to the productivity of the plantation, to care for younger children, fetch water, gather firewood, and assist with chores in the fields or the household. In Margaret's case, growing up on a Kentucky plantation meant that she was constantly reminded of the limitations imposed upon her body and mind by her enslavers. She would have observed the harsh punishments inflicted on those who failed to meet expectations, a daily lesson in obedience and fear. Yet even within this harsh environment, children like Margaret developed an acute awareness of injustice, a sense of self that persisted despite systemic attempts to erase it, and an understanding of the precariousness of their existence. Every aspect of her early life, the food she ate, the shelter she slept in, the people she interacted with, was filtered through the lens of slavery, creating a foundation for the extraordinary choices she would make later in life. Margaret's family relationships were profoundly affected by the conditions of slavery. Families were frequently torn apart by sales, transfers, and the whims of slaveholders. Margaret may have grown up with siblings, parents, or extended family members, but there was always the looming threat that they could be separated at any moment. This instability created a deep-seated anxiety and urgency around familial bonds, instilling a fierce protectiveness in children who understood that their loved ones' lives were never truly their own. For Margaret, the experience of growing up under this constant threat likely shaped her maternal instincts and her later decisions. Her understanding of love, protection, and sacrifice was inseparable from the harsh reality that slavery made every familial relationship precarious and every bond potentially temporary. She was born into a system that demanded compliance, yet within her heart she carried the seeds of resistance, the knowledge that human life and dignity could never fully be extinguished by the chains of oppression. Education for Margaret would have been extremely limited, if it existed at all. In Kentucky, like in much of the South, it was illegal or highly discouraged to teach enslaved people to read or write, as literacy was seen as a threat to the institution of slavery. This meant that her knowledge of the world, her understanding of rights, and her ability to articulate resistance were all shaped by oral traditions, observation, and personal experience. She would have learned stories from elders, absorbed lessons from the natural world, and witnessed the struggles and acts of courage performed by others in bondage. This informal education, though constrained by the circumstances of her life, provided her with the moral and emotional framework to understand injustice and the yearning for freedom. Margaret's mind, like her body, was trained to endure hardship, to navigate the perilous terrain of slavery, and to recognize both the fragility and the resilience of human life under such a system. The society into which Margaret was born also imposed a rigid racial hierarchy that defined every interaction and opportunity. In Kentucky, laws and customs ensured that Black people were treated as inferior, subjugated, and controlled. Margaret's early experiences would have been colored by constant surveillance, restrictions on movement, and the understanding that any deviation from the rules could result in brutal punishment. These external pressures created an environment in which Margaret learned to negotiate her existence carefully, to understand the power dynamics surrounding her, and to anticipate the cruelty that could emerge without warning. The lessons she absorbed about fear, vigilance, and survival were not abstract. They were life or death, shaping every decision she would make as she grew older. Margaret's physical and emotional development was also deeply influenced by the labor she was forced to perform and the conditions she endured. Malnutrition, overwork, and exposure to harsh weather were common realities for enslaved children, and these factors affected health, strength, and resilience. Emotionally, the constant threat of punishment, and the witnessing of violence against peers, family members, or herself would have instilled a complex mixture of fear, defiance, and determination. The duality of vulnerability and emerging strength characterized the formative years of Margaret Garner, preparing her for the impossible choices that would later define her place in history. Her early life was a crucible in which innocence was constantly tested, where the natural desires of a child had to contend with the imposed realities of a society that denied her freedom and humanity. In 1856, Margaret Garner made one of the most daring and fateful decisions of her life. She escaped from the Kentucky plantation where she had been enslaved, seeking freedom across the Ohio River in the free state of Ohio. This journey was not simply a matter of walking away. It was a perilous undertaking fraught with immense risk, fear, and uncertainty. For enslaved people, escaping was considered a criminal act, punishable by severe physical punishment, imprisonment, or even death. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 had made the act of fleeing even more dangerous, as it required that escaped enslaved individuals be returned to their enslavers even if they were found in a free state, and imposed penalties on anyone who aided them. Margaret's decision to flee was therefore not only a physical escape, but a moral and existential gamble, a choice that demonstrated extraordinary courage, desperation, and a relentless desire to reclaim her and her family's autonomy. Margaret did not escape alone. She was accompanied by her husband Robert Garner, and their children. The family's decision to leave Kentucky together reflected a profound commitment to each other, as well as a shared understanding of the life-threatening dangers that awaited them. The logistics of escaping were daunting. They had to plan how to leave the plantation without alerting overseers or family members loyal to the enslaver, how to cross the Ohio River undetected, and how to survive in a world that was often hostile even to free black people. Each step of the journey required careful calculation and immense bravery. The Ohio River itself was a formidable barrier. Its currents were strong, the terrain difficult, and the threat of capture constant. Yet for Margaret and her family, the river symbolized the boundary between bondage and the elusive promise of freedom. Crossing it was a physical act, but it was also a profound psychological and spiritual leap, embodying hope, defiance, and the yearning to reclaim control over their lives. The escape to Ohio was also shaped by the network of people and resources known as the Underground Railroad, although it is unclear to what extent Margaret Garner directly relied on its assistance. This clandestine network of abolitionists, free black communities, and sympathetic whites provided guidance, shelter, and supplies to those fleeing slavery. For many escaping enslaved people, knowledge of safe routes, trusted contacts, and secret hiding places could mean the difference between life and death. Margaret's journey illustrates the extraordinary bravery required not only to undertake such a flight, but also to navigate a society in which every encounter could lead to capture. The fear of betrayal, the need for secrecy, and the constant vigilance required to avoid detection created immense psychological pressure on her and her family. Each moment of movement had to be measured, each step calculated, as they made their way toward what they hoped would be safety and liberty. The emotional weight of escaping with her children added a profound dimension to Margaret's journey. Mothers in bondage were acutely aware of the threats to their children's lives and futures, and Margaret carried the heavy responsibility of protecting her family while also contending with the knowledge that their freedom was fragile and contingent on forces far beyond their control. Her maternal instincts would soon clash with the cruel realities of slavery and the laws that enforced it, setting the stage for the tragic decisions that would later define her story. The combination of fear, hope, and determination that marked her escape exemplifies the complexity of enslaved people's experiences, revealing not only the external dangers they faced, but also the internal struggles that accompanied every choice in the pursuit of freedom. The journey to Ohio was also a confrontation with the broader social and political landscape of the United States at the time. The mid-1850s were a period of intense national tension over the issue of slavery, with debates over states' rights, the expansion of slavery into new territories, and the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law polarizing communities across the country. For Margaret and her family, escaping into Ohio placed them at the intersection of these national conflicts. While Ohio was a free state, it was not entirely safe. Laws, local authorities, and private citizens could still pose threats, and the reach of slave catchers extended into ostensibly free territory. Their escape was thus an act of both personal and political significance, challenging not only the immediate authority of their enslavers, but also the broader system that sought to maintain slavery through legal, social and economic means. Margaret Garner's flight to Ohio also illuminates the extraordinary resilience and resourcefulness required of those who sought freedom. Enslaved people were denied basic tools, knowledge and preparation for survival outside of bondage, yet they managed to navigate forests, rivers, towns and roads under the constant threat of capture. Margaret's ability to move her family, manage their fear, and confront the physical and psychological demands of the journey speaks to her intelligence, courage and determination. Her escape was an assertion of humanity in the face of a system designed to strip her of agency, identity and hope. It was a rebellion not just against her immediate enslaver but against the entire structure of slavery, a refusal to accept a life predetermined by the color of her skin and the property laws of the time. Upon reaching Ohio, Margaret and her family were temporarily beyond the immediate control of their enslavers, but the relief was fleeting. The legal system, particularly under the fugitive slave laws, still endangered their freedom. Margaret's arrival in Ohio marked the beginning of a new set of challenges: securing safe shelter, evading slave catchers, and navigating a society that was often ambivalent or hostile toward black refugees. The precariousness of her newfound liberty underscored the limits of freedom for escaped enslaved people in the North, revealing that physical escape was only one step in the broader struggle for safety, dignity, and self-determination. Every moment in Ohio demanded vigilance, adaptability and courage, as Margaret confronted both the hope of liberation and the imminent possibility of recapture. Margaret Garner's 1856 escape to Ohio stands as a testament to the extraordinary lengths enslaved people were willing to go in pursuit of freedom. It was an act shaped by desperation, courage and profound maternal devotion. Every aspect of the journey, from planning to execution, from crossing the Ohio River to navigating an unfamiliar landscape, reflects the extraordinary risks and moral complexities faced by those seeking to reclaim their lives from the grip of slavery. Her escape illuminates the broader human dimensions of slavery, revealing how oppression shaped choices, relationships and survival strategies, and how acts of courage and resistance could unfold even under the most constrained and dangerous circumstances. Margaret Garner's most infamous and harrowing act occurred in 1856, shortly after her escape to Ohio, when she made the unimaginable decision to kill her own daughter rather than allow her to be returned to slavery. This tragic event was not a product of malice or madness, but a desperate and heart-rending choice born from the brutal reality of bondage and the maternal instinct to protect her children from a lifetime of suffering. To fully understand this act, it is essential to examine the circumstances leading up to it, the psychological and emotional pressures that informed it, and the broader social and legal context in which it occurred. Margaret's act was, in essence, both a cry of defiance against the institution of slavery, and a reflection of the moral and emotional crises that slavery imposed on enslaved mothers. After crossing the Ohio River with her family, Margaret believed she had reached a place where they could be free. However, freedom was tenuous in a northern state, due to the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which mandated that escaped enslaved people be returned to their owners and criminalized those who aided them. This law extended the reach of Southern slaveholders into free states, creating an environment of fear and insecurity for those who had fled bondage. Margaret and her family were acutely aware that capture could come at any moment. The very possibility of recapture transformed a temporary sense of safety into a constant state of dread. Margaret's maternal instincts, forged under the knowledge that her children could be torn from her hands at any instant, collided with the horrifying realization that even escape could not guarantee protection. The fear for her children's future, one defined by relentless labor, violence and dehumanization, was unbearable and shaped the extreme measures she took. The moment of her tragic act occurred during an attempted apprehension by slave catchers who had tracked her family to Cincinnati, Ohio. Faced with imminent capture, Margaret's mind confronted a stark choice: allow her children to be forcibly returned to the plantation and subjected to the unimaginable cruelties of slavery, or take their lives herself to spare them that fate. In the face of such an impossible decision, she chose the latter. She struck down her young daughter, attempting to end the child's life before the slaveholders could claim her. Other children in the family were harmed or threatened as well, illustrating the breadth of Margaret's desperation and the enormity of the moral burden she bore. This act, horrifying to contemporary observers and historians alike, must be understood in the context of the extraordinary pressures and ethical dilemmas imposed by slavery, which systematically denied enslaved people the ability to protect their loved ones in any conventional way. Margaret's decision has been analyzed extensively by historians, legal scholars and ethicists, all of whom grapple with the tension between her maternal instincts
and the societal definitions of morality and law. From one perspective, her act can be seen as a manifestation of agency within the severely constrained circumstances of slavery, a form of ultimate resistance against the institution that sought to control not only her labor but also her family and her body. By choosing to kill her daughter, she exerted a measure of control over her children's fate, asserting a tragic autonomy in a situation where autonomy was otherwise systematically denied. Her act challenges conventional understandings of morality by situating ethical decision-making within the extreme conditions of enslavement, where legal definitions of right and wrong were inseparable from the structures of oppression. The immediate aftermath of Margaret Garner's actions was one of shock, outrage and intense public scrutiny. Newspapers across the North and South reported on the event, often sensationalizing the story and framing Margaret in ways that reflected the biases and anxieties of their respective audiences. Southern newspapers depicted her act as monstrous, emphasizing her transgression against the natural order of motherhood, and using the story to reinforce racist stereotypes of black women as inherently dangerous or morally deficient. Northern newspapers, while sometimes more sympathetic, still struggled to reconcile the horror of the act with the systemic cruelty of slavery that had precipitated it. The Garner case became a flashpoint for national debates on slavery, maternal rights, morality and the legal obligations imposed by the fugitive slave law, exposing deep divisions within American society. Legally, Margaret's case was complex and unprecedented. Her attempted escape and the subsequent killing of her daughter forced authorities and courts to consider questions about the limits of maternal authority, the status of enslaved people under the law, and the application of criminal statutes to acts committed under extreme duress. The fugitive slave law complicated matters further, as it mandated that she be returned to her enslaver despite the extraordinary circumstances surrounding her action. Legal proceedings examined not only the act itself but the conditions under which it occurred, revealing the profound inadequacies of a legal system that could not account for the moral and psychological dimensions of slavery. Margaret's plight illustrated the intersection of law and oppression, showing how legal frameworks often exacerbated human suffering rather than mitigating it. Psychologically, the act had profound implications for Margaret herself. Mothers in bondage were acutely aware of the impossibility of protecting their children under the system of slavery, and Margaret's choice reflects both the depth of her anguish and the extraordinary emotional resilience she displayed. The act cannot be understood outside of the context of systemic dehumanization, relentless surveillance, and the denial of basic human rights. It is a stark reminder of the moral and emotional toll slavery exacted, not only through physical labor and violence, but also through the forced negotiation of impossible ethical dilemmas. Margaret's decision exemplifies the intersection of personal agency and structural oppression, revealing how individuals navigated choices under conditions that denied them conventional freedoms and protection. Margaret Garner's tragic act also resonates symbolically as a statement about the human cost of slavery. It highlights the extreme measures enslaved people were sometimes forced to consider to protect themselves and their loved ones. While deeply disturbing, her story forces a confrontation with the broader system that created such moral impossibilities in the first place. Her act became a lens through which abolitionists, historians and later cultural figures examined the inherent violence and cruelty of slavery, and it remains a powerful example of the moral, emotional and ethical complexities that defined the lives of those who lived under bondage. Margaret's act of killing her daughter is often interpreted in conjunction with her broader escape attempt, demonstrating how acts of resistance and survival were intertwined with acts of protection and despair. Every decision she made in those moments reflected both a calculated understanding of risk and the deep emotional stakes involved. Her story continues to challenge readers, historians and audiences to grapple with the unimaginable pressures faced by enslaved mothers, the extremities of human desperation, and the moral ambiguities forced upon those living under a system designed to strip them of agency, dignity and hope. It is a story that demands both horror and empathy, an event that exposes the full weight of slavery's cruelty while also illuminating the extraordinary strength, intelligence and love that sustained those who dared to resist it.
Margaret Garner's case did not remain a private tragedy confined to her family. It quickly became a national spectacle, igniting intense debate across the United States about slavery, law, morality, and human rights. The legal and public response to her act of killing her daughter while fleeing slavery underscored the profound tensions within American society in the mid-19th century, particularly in the wake of the Fugitive Slave Law of 18. This law, enacted as part of a compromise intended to quell sectional conflict, mandated that escaped enslaved people be returned to their enslavers even if they reached free states, and it imposed severe penalties on anyone who assisted them. In Margaret's case, the law placed her in immediate jeopardy, rendering her escape incomplete, and turning her desperate act into a catalyst for nationwide outrage and reflection. The case became a focal point for newspapers, politicians, and activists on both sides of the slavery debate. Southern media outlets framed Margaret's actions as criminal and unnatural, emphasizing the horror of a mother killing her child and using the narrative to reinforce racist stereotypes about black women. They depicted her act as proof of the dangers posed by granting enslaved people freedom, portraying her as morally corrupt and inherently violent. This narrative served to justify the maintenance of slavery by painting it as a necessary structure to control a supposedly uncontrollable population. The reaction in the South highlighted the ways in which enslaved people's resistance was frequently distorted to serve ideological purposes, turning human suffering into a tool for political reinforcement. Northern responses were more varied and complex. Some abolitionist newspapers and commentators expressed profound sympathy for Margaret, interpreting her actions as the ultimate expression of maternal love constrained by an oppressive system. They highlighted the impossible moral calculus she faced. To protect her child from the brutalities of slavery, she made a decision that, under ordinary circumstances, would be unthinkable. Abolitionists used her case to expose the inhumanity of slavery, arguing that no system could demand obedience while simultaneously preserving morality and decency. They framed Margaret's act not as a crime but as a tragic consequence of systemic injustice, emphasizing the urgent need to dismantle slavery. In doing so, her story became a powerful tool for advocacy, illustrating both the moral contradictions of the law and the human suffering it engendered. Legally, Margaret's case posed unprecedented challenges. Courts and attorneys had to grapple with questions that had rarely been tested in U.S. law. Could a mother under extreme duress be held fully accountable for the death of her child? How did the fugitive slave law apply in cases where enslaved individuals committed acts in defense of their families or to prevent further oppression? The legal system was ill-equipped to address these moral complexities, operating instead on strict interpretations of property rights and criminal statutes. Margaret was viewed primarily as property under the law, and her children were similarly considered the property of her enslaved. This legal framework stripped her of agency and forced society to confront the paradoxes inherent in a system that defined people as property while simultaneously punishing acts of human resistance. The proceedings surrounding Margaret Garner's case also drew attention to the role of race, gender, and maternal authority within the legal system. As a black woman, her actions were interpreted through the lens of both racial and gendered stereotypes. She was judged not only for the act itself but for her perceived deviation from expected norms of womanhood and motherhood. The moral outrage elicited by her act was intensified by societal expectations that mothers protect life at all costs, an expectation that ignored the extreme constraints imposed by slavery. At the same time, her identity as an enslaved black woman complicated the narrative of moral responsibility, revealing the deeply biased assumptions underpinning legal and public discourse. Margaret's case exposed the intersection of race, gender, and law in a society where justice was fundamentally shaped by inequality and oppression. The political implications of the Garner case were equally profound. Her story entered the broader national conversation at a time when sectional tensions over slavery were reaching a boiling point. The reaction to her act reflected the deep divisions between North and South, highlighting the conflicting ideologies that would eventually lead to civil war. In the South, her act was used to argue for stricter enforcement of fugitive slave laws and for the necessity of maintaining the institution of slavery. In the North, her story fueled abolitionist sentiment, illustrating the moral crises created by slavery and reinforcing arguments for emancipation. Margaret Garner became a symbol of the human stakes in the national debate, a reminder that slavery was not an abstract political issue but a lived reality with devastating consequences for mothers, children, and family. The sensationalism surrounding her case also revealed the media's role in shaping public perception of slavery and resistance. Newspapers often exaggerated details, used inflammatory language, and framed the story to suit ideological agenda. The tension between sensational reporting and moral advocacy created a complex public narrative in which Margaret was simultaneously vilified and lionized, condemned and sympathized with. This duality reflected the broader societal struggle to reconcile the reality of slavery with emerging moral consciousness, forcing Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about the violence, coercion, and suffering inherent in the system. Margaret Garner's case also had lasting cultural and social ramifications. It became a touchstone for discussions about the morality of slavery, the legal and ethical responsibilities of individuals under oppressive systems, and the psychological toll of bondage on family. Writers, historians, and artists have since revisited her story, interpreting it as a lens through which to explore maternal resistance, the limits of law, and the human cost of slavery. Her story resonated not only as a historical event but as a moral parable, compelling society to grapple with the profound ethical dilemmas faced by those living under the weight of systemic injustice. In the end, the national debate ignited by Margaret Garner's act revealed much about the American conscience, the limits of law under systemic oppression, and the extraordinary courage and despair of enslaved mothers. Her case illustrated the contradictions inherent in a society that claimed to uphold freedom while systematically denying it to millions, exposing the deep moral, legal and social fractures that would shape the nation's future. It became a story of law, politics, media and morality intertwined, a tragic testament to the human consequences of slavery and a symbol of the desperate, courageous and heartbreaking choices that bondage forced upon individuals. The case of Margaret Garner highlighted the moral and psychological horrors of slavery in ways that few events had done before, revealing the profound human cost of a system built on oppression, coercion and dehumanization. Slavery in the United States was not simply an economic arrangement, it was a social and cultural institution that stripped individuals of their autonomy, subjected them to violence and exploitation, and imposed impossible ethical dilemmas. Margaret Garner's life and the actions she took while fleeing bondage illustrate the extreme pressures placed on enslaved people and the ways in which these pressures eroded the conventional boundaries of morality and legality. Her story exposes the reality that slavery was an institution designed to inflict suffering not only through labor and physical punishment, but also through emotional, psychological and moral coercion. From the moment she was born into slavery in Kentucky, Margaret's world was shaped by systemic violence and exploitation. Enslaved people were considered property rather than human beings, and their labor bodies and lives were controlled entirely by their enslavers. Margaret's formative years were marked by constant exposure to the harsh realities of bondage, the fear of punishment for minor infractions, the witnessing of beatings and other forms of physical violence, and the awareness that her family could be torn apart at any moment through sale or transfer. These conditions created profound psychological strain, instilling fear, vigilance, and an acute awareness of the fragility of life and family under slavery. The moral and emotional frameworks that guided Margaret's decisions later in life were forged in this crucible of oppression, demonstrating how the horrors of slavery extended far beyond physical labor and into the very core of human experience. The psychological toll of slavery is perhaps most evident in Margaret Garner's decision to kill her daughter during her flight to freedom. This act, which shocked the nation and has haunted historians ever since, was rooted in an impossible moral dilemma. Margaret was faced with the choice between allowing her child to be returned to bondage, where she would likely experience extreme suffering, exploitation and abuse, or ending her child's life to protect her from that fate. The fact that this choice was even conceivable is a testament to the moral and psychological violence inherent in slavery. Enslaved mothers were forced to reconcile their natural instincts to protect their children with the systemic reality that the institution of slavery could claim their offspring as property at any time. Margaret's act of filicide is thus a stark illustration of how slavery imposed impossible ethical decisions, distorting the moral landscape and forcing individuals to navigate situations that no free person would ever encounter. The broader societal reaction to Margaret Garner's case further underscores the psychological horrors of slavery. Her actions were sensationalized in newspapers and debated in public forums across the country, reflecting the intense anxiety and moral confusion that her case provoked. In the South, she was portrayed as monstrous, reinforcing the stereotype of black women as dangerous and morally deviant. In the North, she became a symbol of the desperate, tragic consequences of slavery, illustrating the extreme lengths to which enslaved people were driven by the system's cruelty. The polarized reactions highlight how slavery created moral ambiguity not just for those enslaved, but for the entire society, forcing individuals to confront questions of justice, humanity and morality that were inextricably tied to the institution of human bondage. The psychological impact of slavery on enslaved people extended beyond extreme cases like Margaret Garner's. Everyday experiences of oppression, surveillance and violence inflicted chronic stress, fear and trauma. Enslaved individuals lived under constant threat of punishment for perceived disobedience, of being sold away from family members, and of having their bodies subjected to forced labor and sexual exploitation. These conditions created a pervasive environment of insecurity, shaping the ways in which enslaved people thought, acted and related to one another. The moral and psychological pressures imposed by slavery meant that even ordinary decisions, how to navigate interactions with enslavers, how to protect family members, how to seek moments of personal dignity, were fraught with danger and ethical complexity. Margaret Garner's extreme actions can thus be seen as an intensified expression of the everyday moral and psychological burdens that slavery imposed on all who lived under it. The moral questions raised by Margaret Garner's act resonate with broader debates about human rights and ethical responsibility under oppressive systems. Her story challenges the notion that morality can be understood in absolute terms when individuals are constrained by structures designed to dehumanize and control them. In this context, her actions can be interpreted as a form of moral resistance,
an attempt to assert agency and protect her family even when conventional avenues of choice were denied. The psychological strain she endured illustrates the limits of human endurance under slavery, revealing how systemic oppression can distort ethical reasoning and compel acts that defy conventional moral judgment. Her case forces a confrontation with the ways in which institutions like slavery manipulate, constrain, and exploit human behavior, creating circumstances in which survival, protection, and morality collide in tragic and inescapable ways. The legal dimensions of the case also illuminate the horrors of slavery. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 meant that escaped enslaved people like Margaret could be captured even in free states, and those who assisted them faced severe penalty. This legal framework reinforced the systemic power of slavery, extending the reach of enslavers and placing additional psychological pressure on those seeking freedom. Margaret's awareness of the law and its consequences likely informed her desperate decision-making, as she understood that conventional means of protection or escape might not be sufficient to safeguard her children. The law itself thus became a tool of psychological terror, compounding the already overwhelming moral and emotional pressures of enslavement. Margaret Garner's story also reveals the societal complicity in maintaining the horrors of slavery. The reactions of neighbors, authorities, and the media demonstrate that the psychological and moral burdens of slavery were not borne solely by the enslaved, but by the society that upheld the institution. Public fascination, sensationalism, and judgment reflected broader anxieties about race, morality, and the stability of the social order, illustrating how slavery distorted human relationships and ethical perspectives on multiple levels. Her case becomes a mirror through which the nation's collective moral and psychological failings are reflected, showing how systemic injustice can permeate society and shape the consciousness of both oppressors and observers. Finally, Margaret Garner's story serves as a reminder that the horrors of slavery were not abstract or historical curiosities, but profoundly human experiences with lasting emotional, psychological, and moral consequences. The fear, desperation, and impossible ethical choices she faced highlight the extreme pressures under which enslaved people lived and resisted. Her life and actions illustrate how slavery inflicted suffering not only through physical labor and violence, but through sustained psychological trauma, moral compromise, and the constant threat to family and personal integrity. By examining her story, we gain insight into the full dimensions of slavery's cruelty, the moral complexity it imposed, and the extraordinary courage and resilience of those who endured it. Margaret Garner became more than just a woman fleeing slavery. She emerged as a symbol of resistance and the desperate measures that enslaved people were forced to take in order to reclaim their freedom and protect their family. Her story, seared into the American consciousness through newspapers, court cases, and later cultural interpretations, illustrates the lengths to which individuals would go to defy a system designed to strip them of agency, dignity, and humanity. The circumstances of her life, the choices she made, and the consequences she faced offer a window into the broader patterns of resistance within the institution of slavery and the extraordinary courage required to confront an oppressive society. In examining her legacy, one sees not only the personal tragedy she endured, but also the profound significance of her actions as a form of defiance against an institution that sought to control every aspect of her life. Resistance among enslaved people took many forms, ranging from subtle acts of defiance to bold escapes, and Margaret Garner's choices fall within this spectrum. Enslaved individuals often had limited means to assert their autonomy, and even small acts, refusing a task, feigning illness, hiding food, or secret communication were forms of resistance. Margaret's flight across the Ohio River represented a dramatic escalation of this resistance, demonstrating both courage and a willingness to confront life-threatening risk in the pursuit of freedom. Escaping from slavery was fraught with danger. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 ensured that escaped enslaved people could be hunted, captured, and returned even in free state. The act of fleeing required careful planning, knowledge of safe routes, and sometimes the assistance of the Underground Railroad. It was, in essence, an act of rebellion that directly challenged the legal and social framework of slavery. Margaret's decision to undertake this journey placed her squarely in the tradition of enslaved resistance, highlighting the extraordinary bravery required to assert one's humanity in the face of overwhelming oppression. The killing of her daughter during the escape further intensified the symbolic weight of Margaret Garner's resistance. While the act itself was deeply tragic, it was motivated by an extraordinary desire to protect her children from the horrors of slavery. Enslaved mothers were acutely aware that their children were considered property and could be sold, abused, or forced into labor at any moment. Margaret's extreme action illustrates the moral and emotional burdens placed on enslaved parents and serves as an extraordinary example of resistance through the assertion of agency over her family's fate. In her mind, killing her child was a form of protection, a radical assertion of autonomy in a context that offered no other viable means to safeguard her loved ones. This act complicates conventional narratives of resistance, revealing that defiance under slavery was not limited to acts of rebellion against overseers or escape attempts, but could also involve morally complex decisions intended to preserve dignity and life in ways that defied the oppressor's authority. Margaret Garner's story also illuminates the intersection of resistance and visibility. Her case became highly publicized, drawing attention from newspapers, legal authorities and the general public, both in the South and the North. In this sense, her personal act of defiance transcended the private sphere and became a symbol of the broader struggle against slavery. Southern newspapers often portrayed her as monstrous, emphasizing the transgression of maternal norms, while Northern abolitionist press framed her actions as evidence of the moral and human cost of slavery. This duality highlights how resistance could be interpreted, manipulated and leveraged within public discourse. Margaret's story was transformed from an individual act of desperation into a national symbol of the human stakes in the conflict over slavery, showing how individual resistance could resonate far beyond the immediate circumstances in which it occurred. The moral courage embedded in Margaret Garner's actions reflects the psychological dimensions of resistance under slavery. Enslaved people were subjected to constant surveillance, physical punishment and the threat of family separation, conditions that created profound fear, anxiety and trauma. To resist, whether through escape or other acts, required not only physical courage but also mental fortitude and the ability to navigate extreme risk and uncertainty. Margaret's decisions, particularly in relation to her children, illustrate the intersection of moral reasoning, emotional resilience and practical action under conditions of severe constraint. Her resistance was not an impulsive or irrational act but one informed by acute awareness of the dangers imposed by the institution of slavery and by a deeply rooted commitment to protecting her family's well-being even at a devastating personal cost. Margaret Garner's legacy as a symbol of resistance also extends to cultural and historical memory. Her story has inspired novels, music, academic studies and public discussions about slavery, motherhood and moral agency. Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, for example, draws heavily on Margaret Garner's life, exploring the psychological, emotional and moral dimensions of her experience in ways that illuminate the broader human consequences of slavery. Through such cultural interpretation, Margaret's active resistance continues to challenge audiences to confront the brutality of slavery, the complexity of human decision-making under oppression, and the extraordinary courage required to assert autonomy when every societal structure seeks to deny it. Her story has become emblematic not only of the desperation imposed by slavery but also of the extraordinary strength and moral complexity that enslaved people displayed in resisting it. Resistance, as embodied by Margaret Garner, was not limited to physical actions. It also encompassed moral and emotional dimensions. Her choices reflect the constant negotiation of risk, fear and responsibility that defined life under slavery. To resist was to assert one's humanity against a system designed to strip it away, to make decisions that challenged both the authority of enslavers and the societal norms that upheld oppression. Margaret's actions underscore the ways in which resistance could be profoundly personal, morally complicated and ethically courageous, challenging simplistic interpretations of what it meant to oppose slavery. Moreover, her story highlights the role of women in the history of resistance. Enslaved women were often subjected to unique forms of oppression, including sexual exploitation, forced reproduction and the constant threat of family separation. In this context, acts of resistance by women, whether in the form of escape, sabotage or maternal defense, demonstrated extraordinary courage and strategic thinking. Margaret Garner's flight and her desperate act of protecting her children exemplify the particular forms of resistance that emerged from the intersection of gendered oppression and systemic slavery. Her story demonstrates that enslaved women were not passive victims but active agents who navigated extraordinary challenges in pursuit of freedom and protection for their families. Margaret Garner's resistance also illuminates the interplay between individual action and structural injustice. Her choices, while intensely personal, were shaped by the broader system of slavery and its attendant legal, social and moral constraints. The extreme measures she took were responses to a system that denied her basic rights, threatened her children's futures and enforced obedience through violence and fear. Resistance, in this sense, was inseparable from the structural context in which it occurred, illustrating how personal agency and systemic oppression were intertwined in the lived experiences of enslaved people. Finally, Margaret Garner's life serves as a powerful reminder of the extraordinary lengths to which enslaved people went to assert agency, protect their families and resist dehumanization. Her story exemplifies both the courage and the moral complexity of resistance, highlighting the ways in which oppressed individuals navigated impossible circumstances with intelligence, determination and love. As a symbol of resistance, Margaret Garner embodies the intersection of personal struggle and historical injustice, providing a lens through which to understand the human capacity for defiance, resilience, and moral courage even under the most extreme conditions.
The newspapers that covered Margaret Garner's story played a critical role in shaping public perception, turning a personal tragedy into a national sensation, and reflecting the polarized attitudes towards slavery in the United States during the mid-19th century. In an era before instant communication, newspapers were the primary means by which information and opinion was disseminated to the public, and the Garner case became a focal point for sensational reporting, ideological debates, and moral outrage. Journalists and editors capitalized on the shocking and emotionally charged nature of her actions, emphasizing the dramatic aspects of the story while often minimizing the broader social and systemic context of slavery. The media coverage of Margaret Garner not only reflected contemporary anxieties about race, gender, and morality, but also helped cement her story in the national consciousness, ensuring that her desperate act would be remembered as both a personal tragedy and a symbol of the horrors of slavery. Southern newspapers overwhelmingly portrayed Margaret Garner in a negative light, emphasizing the perceived monstrosity of her act and reinforcing deeply ingrained racial stereotypes. Headlines and articles described her as unnatural, violent, and morally corrupt, framing her actions as a deviation from the expected norms of motherhood and womanhood. These depictions were carefully constructed to serve ideological purposes, using her story to argue that black women were inherently dangerous, and that the institution of slavery was necessary to control such individuals. By focusing on the horror of her act and presenting her as a cautionary tale, Southern media sought to deflect attention from the systemic violence of slavery itself, shifting moral scrutiny onto the enslaved individual rather than the institution that created the conditions for such desperation. In this sense, media coverage became a tool for perpetuating fear, reinforcing social hierarchies, and shaping public opinion in favor of slavery. In contrast, Northern newspapers and abolitionist publications often offered more sympathetic portrayals, though they were not without their sensationalism. Abolitionist editors highlighted the moral and emotional dilemmas that Margaret faced, framing her act as an extreme response to the cruelty of slavery. They emphasized the impossibility of her situation, a mother confronted with the imminent threat of her children being returned to bondage, a system that denied her autonomy, and a legal framework designed to enforce her subjugation. In this context, her actions were interpreted as a desperate assertion of agency, a tragic form of resistance against an unjust system. Northern readers were invited to consider the human cost of slavery, not merely as a political abstraction but as a deeply personal moral and emotional reality experienced by those who lived under its oppression. The sensationalism in media coverage also extended to vivid, often dramatized descriptions of the events surrounding her escape and the killing of her daughter. Newspapers provided lurid accounts of Margaret's actions, her family's flight, the pursuit by slave catchers, and the ensuing legal battles. These descriptions amplified the emotional intensity of the story, capturing the attention of readers and generating widespread discussion. While such sensationalism sometimes overshadowed the broader historical and systemic context, it also ensured that the story reached a national audience, sparking debates about slavery, morality, and the law. In this way, the press played a dual role. It both distorted and disseminated the narrative, shaping public perception while also preserving the story's place in historical memory. The legal proceedings following Margaret Garner's capture were extensively covered by newspapers, further intensifying public interest and debate. Reporters detailed courtroom arguments, testimony from witnesses, and the strategies employed by lawyers representing the enslaver and those sympathetic to Margaret's plight. The press highlighted the complex legal questions raised by the case, particularly regarding the application of the fugitive slave law and the moral responsibilities of a mother under extreme duress. By bringing these issues into the public sphere, newspapers transformed the Garner case from a private act of desperation into a national conversation about law, justice, and human rights. Readers were encouraged to grapple with the moral ambiguities of the situation, to consider the ethical implications of slavery, and to confront the societal contradictions inherent in a system that claimed to uphold freedom while denying it to millions. The coverage of Margaret Garner also reflected broader cultural anxieties about race and gender. As a black woman and a mother, her actions challenged prevailing notions of morality, femininity, and maternal behavior. Newspapers often framed the story through these lenses, emphasizing the perceived violation of natural and social norms. Southern editors used this framing to argue for stricter control over enslaved populations, portraying her as evidence of the dangers of granting autonomy to black women. Northern newspapers, while more sympathetic, still grappled with societal expectations of motherhood and morality, highlighting the tension between understanding her actions as a response to systemic oppression and viewing them through conventional ethical framework. This intersection of race, gender and media coverage reveals how deeply cultural assumptions shaped the public reception of her story. Moreover, the national dissemination of Margaret Garner's story helped catalyze discussions about the moral legitimacy of slavery itself. By presenting her actions in stark emotional terms, newspapers forced readers to confront the human consequences of bondage, and to question the ethical foundations of a society that allowed such suffering. Abolitionist writers in particular used the case to illustrate the psychological and moral toll of slavery, arguing that no legal system could reconcile the demands of law with the demands of conscience under conditions of oppression. The Garner case thus became not merely a story of personal tragedy but a vehicle for broader social critique, demonstrating the power of media to influence public discourse and to shape collective understanding of systemic injustice. The sensationalism and ideological framing of Margaret Garner's story also had lasting effects on historical memory. The way newspapers reported on the case influenced how subsequent generations would interpret her actions and the broader realities of slavery. Southern narratives often downplayed systemic violence and portrayed enslaved people as morally deficient, while Northern and abolitionist narratives emphasized her courage, desperation, and moral struggle. These competing narratives created a complex legacy in which Margaret Garner was simultaneously vilified and lionized, remembered both as a criminal and as a symbol of resistance. The media's role in constructing this dual legacy underscores the importance of critically examining how stories are told, whose perspectives are amplified, and how sensational reporting can shape both contemporary and historical understanding. In addition, the Garner case highlights the broader role of newspapers in mediating public engagement with slavery. Newspapers were not neutral conveyors of information, they were active participants in shaping moral, political, and social debate. By selecting which details to emphasize, framing narratives in particular ways, and interpreting events through ideological lenses, the press influenced how readers understood both individual acts of resistance and the institution of slavery itself. Margaret Garner's story exemplifies this dynamic, showing how media coverage can both illuminate and distort human experience, turning private suffering into a public spectacle that carries ethical, political, and emotional significance. Finally, the newspaper's coverage of Margaret Garner contributed to the enduring symbolic power of her story. By widely disseminating her actions and the surrounding events, they ensured that her life, choices, and tragic consequences would be remembered as part of the national consciousness. Her story became emblematic of the moral and psychological horrors of slavery, the impossible choices forced upon enslaved individuals, and the courage required to resist oppression. Through sensational reporting, ideological framing, and national dissemination, the press transformed a personal tragedy into a story with enduring cultural, historical, and ethical resonance, one that continues to challenge audiences to grapple with the human cost of systemic injustice. Margaret Garner's capture and subsequent return to slavery highlight the cruel and unrelenting reach of the institution that had shaped her entire life, revealing how deeply entrenched legal and social systems worked to maintain control over enslaved people. After her daring escape to Ohio in 1856, Margaret and her family had believed they were approaching freedom, yet the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 ensured that even in free states, escape offered no guarantee of safety. This law mandated that escaped enslaved individuals be returned to their enslavers and criminalized anyone who aided their flight. Margaret's capture illustrates the systemic oppression that extended far beyond the plantation, demonstrating that slavery was not confined to the physical boundaries of the South but was enforced by law, ideology, and social complicity throughout the nation. Her story exemplifies how enslaved people lived under constant threat, and how the law itself was wielded as a mechanism of terror to suppress autonomy, resistance, and the pursuit of freedom. The capture of Margaret Garner was precipitated by the efforts of slave catchers who actively sought to enforce the fugitive slave law, tracking her and her family despite their movement into a free state. The law effectively nationalized slavery, allowing enslavers to extend their reach beyond state borders and imposing severe legal consequences on anyone assisting runaway enslaved people. Margaret's flight, while courageous and meticulously executed, was therefore always under the shadow of imminent capture. The physical pursuit by slave catchers was matched by psychological terror, as Margaret and her family were acutely aware that their freedom was fragile and that a single misstep could result in recapture. This constant threat created immense stress and shaped the decisions she made, including the tragic act of killing her daughter to prevent her from being returned to bondage. The law itself became a tool of psychological warfare, enforcing compliance through fear and eliminating safe havens for those seeking liberation. The return of Margaret Garner to slavery underscores the legal and moral contradictions of mid-19th century America. Despite her extraordinary actions, which can be understood as acts of desperation and maternal protection, the courts prioritized property rights and the enforcement of the fugitive slave law over considerations of human suffering and moral agency. Margaret and her family were treated primarily as property whose owners had legal rights over their bodies and labor.
This legal framework exemplifies how the law functioned as an instrument of oppression, codifying the subjugation of human beings and leaving no room for the ethical dilemmas faced by enslaved mothers like Margaret. Her case revealed the extent to which legal systems were complicit in maintaining the inhumanity of slavery, enforcing rules that ignored the moral and psychological realities of those living under bondage. Margaret's capture also illustrates the broader societal complicity in sustaining slavery. While her flight was a private act of resistance, it quickly became a public spectacle with neighbors, authorities and law enforcement actively participating in her recapture. Communities in free states were often divided, with some citizens assisting escaped enslaved people through safe houses or other means, while others, motivated by fear, prejudice, or economic interests, cooperated with slave catcher. Margaret's experience demonstrates how the institution of slavery relied not only on legal enforcement, but also on widespread social acquiescence, ensuring that escape and resistance were extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. The social environment, combined with the legal framework, created a context in which enslaved individuals could not easily exercise agency without severe consequences, revealing the pervasive reach of slavery into every aspect of life. The psychological and emotional consequences of Margaret's capture were profound. Having risked everything for freedom, only to be apprehended and returned to the very system she sought to escape, she faced not only physical subjugation, but also the crushing despair of thwarted autonomy. The trauma of capture and return cannot be overstated. It reinforced the absolute power enslavers held over their human property, and the hopelessness of resistance under such conditions. For Margaret, the moral and emotional weight of her earlier decisions, including the killing of her daughter, was compounded by the knowledge that even extraordinary acts of defiance could not secure freedom or protection for her family. The psychological toll on enslaved people subjected to such cycles of hope and recapture exemplifies the deep cruelty of slavery, highlighting the interplay between systemic oppression and individual suffering. Margaret Garner's return to slavery also sheds light on the legal procedures and judicial attitudes of the time. Courts were generally unsympathetic to the plights of enslaved individuals, prioritizing the rights of enslavers and adherence to the fugitive slave law over human wealth. Legal arguments that might have considered her moral intent or the extreme circumstances under which she acted were largely ignored. Testimonies, evidence and appeals were filtered through the lens of property law, reinforcing the dehumanization of those enslaved. Margaret's case reveals the structural barriers to justice for Black people under slavery, illustrating how the legal system functioned, not as a mechanism for protection or fairness, but as a tool for maintaining social hierarchy and control. Her return emphasizes that even acts of extraordinary moral and emotional courage could be legally negated when they conflicted with the entrenched institution of slavery. The capture and return also illustrate the interplay between race, gender and power in the enforcement of slavery. As a Black woman, Margaret's actions were judged through a lens of racialized and gendered assumptions that shaped both public perception and legal outcomes. Her maternal instincts, which motivated her desperate choices, were often recast in public and legal discourse as evidence of moral deviance. These interpretations reflected the broader societal anxieties about the supposed dangers of Black women asserting agency or acting independently, demonstrating how racial and gender prejudices intensified the oppression she experienced. Margaret's story underscores how the enforcement of slavery was not only about physical control but also about shaping narratives, moral judgments, and social perceptions to reinforce dominance and limit resistance. The broader implications of her recapture extend beyond her individual experience, highlighting the precariousness of freedom for all escaped enslaved people. Even reaching a free state did not guarantee safety, and the enforcement of the fugitive slave law created a climate of pervasive fear. Communities, legal systems and political structures were all implicated in the maintenance of slavery, illustrating that the struggle for freedom was never solely a personal or local endeavor but a systemic battle against deeply entrenched national structure. Margaret Garner's experience serves as a stark example of how the legal and social apparatus of slavery worked to suppress resistance and enforce control, demonstrating that the pursuit of freedom was fraught with danger, moral complexity and uncertainty. Furthermore, her capture and return to slavery reveal the long-term human consequences of such enforcement. The trauma, fear and despair experienced by Margaret and her family were emblematic of the experiences of countless enslaved people subjected to recapture. These events had profound psychological, emotional and social effects, shaping behavior, decisions and resistance strategies for the rest of their lives. Margaret's story underscores the cumulative impact of systemic oppression, showing how legal structures, social compliance and the threat of violence combined to maintain a society built on dehumanization. Finally, Margaret Garner's capture and forced return to slavery serve as a stark reminder of the relentless power of the institution she defied. Her courage, desperation and moral decision-making were rendered tragically insufficient against the combined weight of law, society and entrenched oppression. The event illustrates the limits of individual agency under slavery and the extraordinary human cost exacted by a system that denied freedom, family security and autonomy. By examining her experience, one gains insight into the structural brutality of slavery, the challenges faced by those who resisted, and the moral and emotional complexities that defined the lives of enslaved individuals navigating a society determined to control every aspect of their existence. The legacy of Margaret Garner extends far beyond the immediate tragedy of her life and the sensationalized events of 1856, leaving a profound impact on American history, culture, and collective memory. Her story illuminates the enduring consequences of slavery on individuals, families, and society, and serves as a powerful symbol of both the horrors of bondage and the extraordinary resilience of those who resisted it. Over time, historians, writers, and scholars have revisited Margaret's life, exploring the moral, emotional, and social dimensions of her experience, and transforming her personal tragedy into a lens through which to understand the broader historical realities of slavery in the United States. Her legacy reveals how the intersection of race, gender, motherhood, and resistance continues to resonate across generations, highlighting the complexity of human experience under systemic oppression. Margaret Garner's story has been interpreted as a representation of the moral crises imposed by slavery, particularly the impossible choices faced by enslaved mother. Her decision to kill her daughter to prevent her return to bondage is often framed as the ultimate act of maternal protection, illustrating the extent to which slavery distorted ethical and emotional norms. In the broader historical narrative, this act challenges conventional understandings of morality, demonstrating how oppressive systems can force individuals into situations where there are no right choices. Margaret's actions have therefore been studied as both a personal tragedy and a moral allegory, highlighting the ways in which slavery compelled enslaved people to navigate impossible dilemmas, balancing the instinct to preserve life against the reality of systemic cruelty and the denial of autonomy. Culturally, Margaret Garner's legacy has been preserved and reinterpreted through literature, art, and music, most notably in Toni Morrison's novel Beloved. Morrison's fictionalized account draws inspiration from Margaret's life, exploring the psychological and emotional consequences of slavery on mothers and children, the trauma of bondage, and the moral complexities of desperate acts taken under extreme oppression. In doing so, Morrison amplifies Margaret's story, transforming it into a narrative that examines the enduring psychological scars of slavery and the ways in which memory, trauma, and storytelling preserve history. Artistic representations of Margaret's life emphasize both her humanity and her resistance, ensuring that her story remains relevant, and that the lessons it embodies continue to inform contemporary understandings of slavery, motherhood, and moral agency. Margaret Garner's legacy also sheds light on the historical documentation of enslaved women's experiences, which have often been marginalized or silenced in mainstream narrative. Her story stands out because it was recorded through newspapers, court cases, and personal testimonies, allowing future generations to examine the lived realities of enslaved women. These records provide insight into the emotional, psychological, and ethical dimensions of slavery, revealing how women navigated the complex intersection of personal autonomy, maternal responsibility, and systemic oppression. By examining Margaret's life, historians gain a deeper understanding of the ways in which enslaved women resisted, survived, and asserted agency in contexts that sought to deny them both voice and self-determination. In addition to its historical and cultural significance, Margaret Garner's legacy has contributed to legal and ethical discussions about the nature of justice under oppressive systems. Her case challenged contemporary courts to confront the limitations of legal frameworks that prioritized property rights over human rights, raising questions about accountability, moral responsibility, and the capacity of law to address extreme circumstances. Scholars have since examined her story to explore the ethical dimensions of resistance, the tension between legal obligations and moral imperatives, and the ways in which oppressive institutions can distort conventional notions of justice. Margaret's life, thus, serves as both a historical case study and a moral touchstone, illuminating the ethical complexities that arise when law, society, and human suffering intersect. The enduring resonance of Margaret Garner's story also reflects its symbolic power as a narrative of resistance and courage. Her daring escape from Kentucky, the moral complexity of her choices, and the extreme measures she took to protect her family demonstrate extraordinary resilience and agency in the face of systemic oppression. Margaret's actions, while tragic, exemplify the determination of enslaved people to assert control over their lives and to resist a system designed to strip them of autonomy. Her story has inspired generations to consider the human cost of slavery and the moral courage required to confront injustice, highlighting the ways in which personal acts of resistance can have enduring symbolic and cultural significance. Margaret Garner's legacy is further intertwined with the broader historical memory of slavery in the United States. Her story provides a lens through which to examine the psychological and moral dimensions of bondage, illustrating how slavery's impact extended far beyond physical labor to shape relationships, family structures, and individual identity. By preserving her narrative, historians, educators, and cultural commentators have been able to highlight the human consequences of slavery, ensuring that the experiences of those who lived under oppression are remembered and honored. In this way, Margaret Garner's life serves as a bridge between historical documentation, cultural representation, and ethical reflection, reinforcing the ongoing relevance of her story and understanding the full scope of American slavery. The continued engagement with Margaret Garner's story also underscores the importance of centering marginalized voices in historical discourse. Her life illuminates the specific experiences of enslaved women and mothers, providing insight into the gendered dimensions of oppression and resistance. The focus on her choices, motivations, and actions challenges narratives that depict enslaved people as passive victims, instead highlighting their agency, intelligence, and resilience. By examining Margaret's legacy, scholars and audiences alike are encouraged to confront the complexity of human behavior under extreme duress, recognizing both the courage required to resist and the profound moral dilemmas imposed by systemic injustice. In contemporary discourse, Margaret Garner's legacy resonates in discussions about memory, trauma, and the intergenerational impact of slavery. Her story exemplifies how acts of resistance, even those marked by tragedy, carry enduring ethical and emotional significance. The moral, psychological, and cultural dimensions of her life continue to inform conversations about justice, human rights, and the consequences of systemic oppression. Through historical analysis, literature, and public discourse, Margaret Garner remains a central figure in understanding the lived experiences of enslaved people and the extraordinary courage required to navigate a world defined by bondage and inequality. Furthermore, Margaret Garner's life serves as a reminder of the broader societal structures that perpetuated slavery and the human cost of maintaining such systems. Her story exposes the ways in which law, social norms, and cultural attitudes collaborated to deny freedom and agency, shaping both the immediate experiences of enslaved people and the collective memory of their struggle. By studying her actions, legal battles, and the public response, historians gain insight into the mechanisms of oppression, the resistance strategies employed by those subjected to it, and the ethical and emotional consequences of living under a system that systematically dehumanized individuals. Margaret Garner's legacy endures because it encapsulates the intersection of personal tragedy, moral complexity, and historical significance. Her life and actions reveal the human dimensions of slavery, the extraordinary courage required to resist, and the profound ethical dilemmas imposed by oppression. By preserving and analyzing her story, society is compelled to confront the realities of bondage, to acknowledge the resilience and agency of those who resisted, and to reflect on the enduring lessons of history. Her legacy is a testament to the courage of enslaved individuals, the moral challenges posed by systemic injustice, and the ways in which personal narratives can illuminate broader historical truth.
The story of Margaret Garner reaches beyond her immediate experience of slavery, escape, and recapture to serve as a lasting symbol of the struggle for human dignity, agency, and freedom in the United States. Her life encapsulates the profound moral, psychological, and emotional consequences of slavery, illustrating the impossible choices forced upon enslaved individuals and the extraordinary courage required to navigate them. Margaret's narrative has been interpreted and remembered in multiple ways, reflecting the broader social, cultural, and historical implications of her actions. Her case continues to resonate because it embodies the intersection of personal tragedy, resistance, and historical injustice, providing a lens through which to understand not only the cruelty of slavery but also the resilience of those who lived under its constraints. Margaret Garner's act of killing her daughter rather than allowing her to return to bondage represents one of the most tragic and morally complex forms of resistance in American history. It forces a confrontation with the extreme conditions created by slavery, demonstrating how oppression could distort natural moral instincts and compel decisions that defy conventional ethical frameworks. In this sense, her life challenges simple categorizations of right and wrong, crime and virtue by situating her choices within a system designed to deny autonomy and humanity. This moral complexity has made her story an enduring subject for historians, ethicists, and cultural commentators seeking to grapple with the human consequences of systemic oppression. Her actions illuminate the psychological burden placed on enslaved mothers who face not only the fear of personal punishment but also the constant threat of family separation, exploitation, and abuse. The cultural and literary interpretations of Margaret Garner's life have played a key role in preserving her legacy and expanding its significance. Toni Morrison's Beloved, widely recognized as a fictionalized retelling inspired by Margaret, examines the deep psychological trauma, moral dilemmas, and intergenerational consequences of slavery. Through literature, Margaret's story transcends the historical record, allowing readers to explore the emotional and psychological dimensions of her experience. Morrison's narrative emphasizes not only the brutality of slavery but also the enduring consequences of trauma, the complexity of maternal love under oppression, and the moral courage inherent in acts of resistance. By transforming Margaret's personal tragedy into a broader exploration of human experience, literature ensures that her story remains accessible, relevant, and emotionally resonant for successive generations. Margaret Garner's case also holds significant historical and legal import. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which mandated her capture and return, illustrates the reach of slavery beyond the plantations of the South and the systemic legal enforcement of bondage across the United States. Her recapture exemplifies how the law functioned to suppress resistance, punish escape, and maintain control over enslaved populations. Legal proceedings surrounding her case exposed the inadequacies and moral contradictions of a system that prioritized property rights over human life, and demonstrated the limitations of justice for those enslaved. Margaret's story thus serves as a powerful illustration of the intersection between law, morality, and systemic oppression, highlighting how legal frameworks were deployed to sustain injustice while negating the humanity of those subjected to them. Public reaction to Margaret Garner's actions further illustrates the social and ideological dimensions of her story. Newspapers in the South often sensationalized her act, portraying her as morally deviant and using her tragedy to reinforce racialized and gendered stereotypes. Northern newspapers and abolitionist outlets, while sometimes equally sensational in tone, framed her actions as evidence of the moral and psychological consequences of slavery, emphasizing her courage, desperation, and the impossible circumstances she faced. This dichotomy in public perception underscores the polarized attitudes towards slavery in mid-19th century America and highlights the ways in which media coverage could both distort and illuminate human experience. The public discourse surrounding Margaret Garner's case transformed a personal tragedy into a national symbol, sparking debate about morality, justice, and the legitimacy of slavery itself. Margaret's experience also underscores the gendered dimensions of slavery and resistance. Enslaved women were subjected to unique forms of oppression, including sexual exploitation, forced reproductive labor, and the constant threat of family separation. Their acts of resistance, whether through escape, defiance, or protective measures for their children, reflect both extraordinary courage and acute moral reasoning under extreme constraint. Margaret's decisions exemplify the ways in which enslaved women negotiated power, risk, and morality in a system designed to deny them agency. Her story demonstrates that resistance under slavery was not limited to physical acts of defiance, but also encompassed moral and emotional strategies aimed at preserving family, dignity, and human life. The psychological implications of Margaret Garner's life and choices are profound. The trauma of enslavement, the constant fear of recapture, and the moral weight of her actions created an emotional and psychological burden that is difficult to fully comprehend. Her story illuminates the long-term consequences of slavery on mental and emotional well-being, revealing how oppression, violence, and the denial of agency inflicted deep psychological scars. By examining her experience, historians and psychologists alike gain insight into the human cost of bondage, including the emotional strain endured by enslaved mothers who were forced to navigate impossible choices in order to protect their family. Margaret's narrative thus becomes a case study in the intersection of systemic oppression, moral psychology, and maternal love under extreme conditions. Margaret Garner's legacy also emphasizes the role of memory, storytelling, and historical preservation in shaping collective understanding of slavery. Her story, recorded through newspapers, court documents, and later literary interpretations, has been preserved as a touchstone for understanding the human dimensions of bondage. It provides a concrete example of the moral and ethical dilemmas imposed by slavery and highlights the resilience, agency, and courage of those who resisted. By keeping her story alive, society is reminded not only of the brutality of slavery but also of the extraordinary strength of those who lived through it and sought to assert their humanity in the face of overwhelming oppression. Moreover, Margaret Garner's life resonates in contemporary discussions about justice, human rights, and systemic oppression. Her narrative challenges assumptions about morality, legality, and human behavior, forcing reflection on the ways in which societal structures can compel acts that defy conventional ethical norms. Her story remains relevant as a moral and historical touchstone, prompting ongoing dialogue about the consequences of oppression, the responsibilities of society to protect human dignity,
and the ways in which historical injustices continue to shape contemporary understanding of justice. And Margaret Garner's legacy is further amplified by her symbolic power as a figure of resistance. Her courageous flight, the tragic act to protect her children, and her ultimate recapture all highlight the extreme lengths to which enslaved people went to assert autonomy and resist dehumanization. She stands as a testament to the moral complexity, bravery, and resilience of those living under slavery, and her story continues to inspire reflection on the human capacity for courage and ethical decision-making under unimaginable pressure. Her life exemplifies the intersection of personal tragedy and historical significance, ensuring that her story remains a critical part of American memory and scholarship. Finally, the enduring importance of Margaret Garner's story lies in its ability to illuminate both the human and structural dimensions of slavery. Her life encapsulates the trauma, moral dilemmas, and courage that characterized the experiences of countless enslaved people, and her story serves as a vital historical and cultural reference point. By examining Margaret Garner, one gains insight into the profound consequences of systemic oppression, the extraordinary moral and emotional challenges faced by those enslaved, and the ways in which individual acts of resistance can resonate across time. Her legacy continues to challenge audiences to confront the full human cost of slavery, to recognize the resilience of those who resisted, and to reflect on the enduring lessons of history in understanding freedom, justice, and human dignity. Margaret Garner's story ultimately endures as both a cautionary tale and a testament to human resilience. It forces us to confront the unbearable weight of slavery not just as a historical institution, but as a system that distorted morality, fractured families, and demanded impossible choice. Her life reminds us that acts of resistance often come at tremendous personal cost, and that courage and love can manifest in the most heartrending way. Margaret's legacy transcends her era, compelling us to remember the humanity of those whom history often tried to erase, and to reckon with the moral complexities imposed by oppression. In honoring her story, we bear witness not only to tragedy but to extraordinary strength, ensuring that the lessons of her life, the price of freedom, the power of maternal love, and the indomitable will to resist injustice, remain vivid, urgent, and unforgettable.